Welcome you all in today's Bhava Samvad of Kalinga Literature Festival. Today we have a very eminent person, a writer, a professor of economics and finance at IIM Ahmedabad, and a columnist for over three decades now. Professor TT Ram Mohan. Sir, welcome in today's Bhava Samvad of
Thank
Kalinga
you.
Literature Festival. Today
Thank
we'll
you.
talk about his new book, which is thank you. Today we'll talk about his new book, Rebels with a Cause. And and the subtitle is Famous Dissenters and Why They Are Not Being Heard, which clearly signifies something very deep. And Professor Ram Mohan has chosen seven profiles, and the book is centered around these seven people, starting with Arundhati Roy, Kanchai Laya, John Pilzer, Yanis Varoufakis, David Irwin, Oliver Stone, UG Krishnamurti. Let me give you a slight brief about his profile. Professor TT Ram Mohan teaches economics at IIM Ahmedabad. He is graduated from IIT Mumbai and IIM Calcutta and obtained his doctorate from Eastern Business School, New York University. He has been at various points in a time a management consultant, a banker, and financial journalist. Professor Ramon has written for several publications, including the Economic Times, Business Standard, The Hindu, The Wire, Bloomberg, and Quartz. He has served on the boards of several companies and has been a member of committees of Reserve Bank of India and Securities and Exchange Board of India. His earlier books include Privatization in India, Challenging Economic Orthodoxy, Brick by Brick, Ravi Mathai and the Making of IIM Ahmedabad. Basically, a history of IIM Ahmedabad and its founder, Ravi Mathai. Second one was Rethink, what is broke at today's corporations and how to fix it. And the first one was, in fact, Towards a Safer World of Banking, the Bank Revolution After the Subprime Crisis. So with us today, we have somebody who should be better known as a living legend on policy front. And his book comes out with so many surprise elements for his readers who have been following for years. Sir, what prompted you to write this book? I will start with this.
Well, it occurred to me that there isn't an awful lot of dissent in society, even though there's a lot of commitment or profession of tolerating dissent. So there's a lot of lip service paid to freedom of speech and tolerance of dissent. But if you look at it very closely, even in seemingly democratic societies, tolerance of dissent is fairly narrow. I mean, you're allowed to express yourself, but within a certain predetermined band, so to speak. And if you transgress the boundaries, you invariably end up paying a price. Now, this is not only about political dissent, because the only thing that you hear about from time to time is the muffling of political dissent. And so, in this country, in the last few years and under the present government, we've had this debate about intolerance. As though it is something very new, or there's something very different that this government is doing. But my point is that even if you look outside the political sphere, and if you look at all kinds of organizations, whether it's the corporate world or even non-government organizations, if you look at the bureaucracy, even if you look at academic institutions, you will find that the genuine dissent or profound kind of dissent is fairly rare. And the reason that it is so rare is because it is severely penalized, and dissenters who questions the fundamentals of the system in which they are operating end up getting marginalized. And that is if they are lucky. If you're unlucky, you just get thrown into jail, or you may even pay for your dissent with your life. And so when I say this, many people who live in democratic societies may seem shocked, but it's not very far from the reality. And so I thought that it's useful to see what sort of dissent is allowed and within what boundaries. And I thought there's no better way of illustrating this than by looking at some people who have managed to get their dissent heard, even if not always in the mainstream media or the mainstream channels. But somehow or the other, these dissenters have managed to be heard. And they've also ended up paying a particular price for it, in the sense that they don't get much play in the mainstream media or even some of the social media. And I thought by looking at the kind of dissent that they've expressed, we can understand what sort of intolerance is actually practiced. Uh, so let me
Right.
also clarify, while we are on the subject, that I don't particularly agree with many of the things that these dissenters are saying. And you've read the book, and anybody who's read the book will notice that. So I don't agree with them, but I respect their opinions, and I think it's very important that you allow voices such as these to be heard, because I think at a conceptual level, all of us agree that without the clash of ideas, intellectual progress is very difficult. Now, most people will grant this, and yet, within the systems in which they operate, within the institutions in which they wield power, uh, they will not allow too much play for this principle. So, everybody pays lip service to this principle. You must allow people to freely express themselves. Everybody will say that, but in practice, they will not allow people to express themselves very freely. In most organizations, I think this is pretty much the norm. And those anybody, people who are watching this discussion, I would put it to them. You ask yourself, in the organization in which you're working, how much of tolerance of dissent is actually there? Atul?
Network related disruption. I'm back, sir.
Yeah, I think I lost
Sorry,
you
some
briefly.
network issue. I'm back, sir. Sir, as much I have heard from you, and as while reading the book, I made certain perception about your intent to write this book. Then one of them is India is lacking the space for dissent. Not only us. Even if we look beyond the boundaries, the case has been not so encouraging.
Yeah.
We have seen the US election now. There is change of card, and it is expected that we will see a different kind of time. You have dedicated the book to not a single person, but to all those who have had the courage to express dissent when others choose to be silent, which is very heartening for me as a reader. I must tell you. I wanted to know why you have chosen these seven books, seven peoples, and profiled them. And my compliments to your publisher, Penguin Random House India as well, that they have allowed you writing this book, which was most needed at this point of time.
Yeah. So let me. I can't say that it's a very rigorous criteria, but one criterion I used is that they should have a body of work which can be critiqued. So there are many people who speak out against the establishment, but they don't have an organized body of work that you can look at. So I think one criterion certainly is that you should have some record of publication so that one can examine the ideas that the person stands for. The second, of course, is that they should be prominent dissenters. I mean, they should be famous and they should have had some kind of impact. So I think those are the two main criteria that I used, and I also excluded some dissenters who are so famous that I don't need to talk about their work or their ideas. So I mentioned somebody like Noam Chomsky. I think even though he's also marginalized, by now his ideas are fairly well known. So I haven't included somebody like him. I also haven't included somebody like Joseph Stiglitz, who can also be said to be anti-establishment in many ways, because I think Professor Stiglitz's ideas are also fairly well known. So I thought it's useful to look at dissenters who are famous, but whose ideas may not be all that well known. So let me put it that way.
Sorry, sir. You, you may please.
Yeah. So I've just completed. Yes.
Uh, you have chosen these seven people, and they also some sort of contradictions. I mean, if you talk about Arundhati Roy, she had certain observations about the dam politics, etc., which was countered by BG Varghese. I would like to know how much romanticism works while being a decent voice.
Well, that's an interesting
Because
question.
at some point of
Go
time
ahead.
we can't oppose the developmental narrative completely. We have to make an
Yeah,
adjustment,
yeah.
and you have beautifully written about it.
Thank you. Well, let me just add one more point to the question of why these dissenters. I think the third criterion which I used, the first is that you should be famous. The second is that you should have a body of work which can be critiqued, and the third one is that I chose people from different walks of life, so that in looking at their dissent, the book becomes a celebration of ideas in various fields. Sociology, history, the Second World War, philosophy and spirituality, social activism. So, economics. So each dissenter is from, and filmmaking, Oliver Stone. So each dissenter is from a distinctive walk of life. Now, about Arundhati Roy. Um, yeah, I think it's fair for many people to say that she has a sort of romanticized view of many of the things that she's talking about. A romanticized view of Naxalites, for instance. Um, so it is not that one doubts the sincerity of her convictions. So she's very sincere in what she says. Uh, but it did seem to me that in some of the things, in some of the on some of the subjects that she's talking about, uh, she's not adequately researched the subject. I mean, her understanding is not fairly it's not comprehensive enough. So she's, for instance, on the subject of large dams, she certainly burrowed into a lot of the literature. But as I point out in my write-up on her, there's much of importance that's got left out. And therefore, what happens is a somewhat one-sided presentation of issues. So much of what she says about large dams is true, but it's not the whole truth. And so, the, the issues are not looked at in all their complexity. So she oversimplifies matters from time to time. And I guess that is what you perhaps mean by saying so sort of romanticized view of issues. Similarly, on Naxalites, I think she's right about many things. I mean, there's a lot of oppression going on in the forest areas and among the tribals. There's a lot of that going on. But anybody, many people who have looked at it closely would grant that the oppression happens not only on the part of the state, but it also happens on the part of the people who are professing to be who profess to be championing the cause of the tribals, which is the Naxalites themselves. They are also in some way oppressing the forest dwellers while claiming to champion their rights. So you see, one part of that comes out in Arundhati Roy's narrative, which is the oppression
Right.
practiced by the state. But it's not as if the other party has its hands completely clean, so to speak.
Right. Uh, I think somewhere all the dissenters who have made into this book have certain characteristics, common characteristics, like they all present some contradictions with their views. I will now touch upon someone who is very special in his own realm, Oliver Stone. One of the most interesting parts of this book for me, when you balance it out, because he was criticized for interviewing Vladimir Putin. That interview came out as a Putin. Would you like to please enlighten the readers, the viewers, and your potential readers regarding with your personal view on this matter about that particular interview, Putin?
So you want me to talk only about Stone's interview with Putin, or about
I
Stone's
would like
interview?
to talk about everything, including that interview, about Oliver Stone's contributions and all.
Yeah. So Oliver Stone, for the benefit of viewers who may not have heard of him, is a very well-known filmmaker and a successful filmmaker. And he also has paid a price in some sense for the kind of for the films he has made, kind of films he has made. In that he doesn't have easy access to funds, so the conventional sources of funding are very often not available to him, and the films he makes very often require reasonable budgets. Um, And the reason that he has been sort of marginalized or even ostracized is that he sees America as an imperial nation. And while there are many, while he sees many virtues in the United States, including a vibrant capitalist system, he believes that the values which America may practice within the country are not the values that it practices in the conduct of its foreign policy. What America does is to relentlessly pursue national interest, even if it means the sacrifice of many democratic values which it stands for which we all admire the United States of America. So that is the particular point of view that he has. And, he has, this comes out in many of his works, most notably the film version of the book which he wrote, which is a history of the United States, which he co-authored with an academy.
Yes.
And that history is what you might call revisionist history, in the sense that it goes counter to the mainstream view that the United States is a very benign power which works for the general good of mankind, whereas the view that he presents is the United States has practiced its, has pursued its self-interest with little regard for the interests of other nations. So that's the kind of historical narrative that he presents. And now, in relation to Russia, he's of the view that there is a very strong political and military establishment uh, which which prospers by demonizing Russia. So the defense establishment gets to spending more and more and more, and the politicians and others get to handing out, billions of dollars in contracts by feeding the belief that Russia constitutes an existentialist threat to the United States. And if he's of the view, and that this particular political military establishment um, has an interest in demonizing Russia, and in recent decades, an interest in demonizing its leader Vladimir Putin. Um, so he decided to go out and interview Putin and uh, bring out for the benefit of the viewers what sort of personality Putin truly is. I mean, is he the sort of devil incarnate that is made out to be in the Western media? And if you watch those videos, or even if you read the book version of
I
the
did.
interview,
Yes.
yes, even if you read the book version of the interview, you will find that he's quite incisive in his questioning, unsparing in his questioning. It's not that he gives out easy questions for Putin to answer. He's very rigorous in his questions. And what comes out of that interview is a very capable leader with a very good grasp of international affairs, and of course a fierce nationalist, which is what Putin is. And so what you see in that interview is a very human version of Putin. And so when the TV interviews came out, there was a massive backlash in the United States, because this is not something
Right.
which people simply want to hear. They don't want Putin to be shown as a competent,
Positive light. Yeah.
a competent leader and perhaps statesman. Not positive light, but just another competent
Yes.
person who has his own view of international affairs and United States,
Mm.
the position of United States in the modern world today. And so they don't want that particular viewpoint to be given any sort of airing. And so when
Yeah.
this series of TV interviews came out, it only reinforced the image of Oliver Stone as anti-American, which is not the case. I mean, it's the same story over here, that if somebody is anti-government, you tend to brand him or her anti-national. But being critical of particular aspects of American foreign policy, or being critical of the American establishment, doesn't mean that you don't have no loyalty towards the United States.
Right.
In fact, Stone would argue that it's precisely because he is fiercely loyal to the United States and has a great deal of affection for it, that he wants the, what he believes to be the true version of reality to be known to people at large.
Yeah. For many of us, Oliver Stone can be a hero because we also have our own electronic media. Sadly, at top of the political order, people don't give interviews, unfiltered interviews. So, in that sense, I also appreciate Mr. Putin. I don't know how much, how cozy he is with the idea of liberalism. But one thing is certain: he is a fierce nationalist. He is a competent leader, no doubt about it. We also have in our country our prime minister who is a fierce nationalist, who is also a competent person. He's not opens up so often with the media. But if we will compare Oliver Stone with our own top anchors, we know who they are. But Oliver Stone was criticized just for posing a benign gesture, although he kept asking the difficult questions to Putin. But in
Yes.
our country, whenever prime minister is interviewed, we don't see both the tendencies. Because being benign is not a bad thing, but sometimes to justify that I am an independent, they go an extra mile. At the same time, their questions have no spine. So wanted to know what is your take on Indian media, how they are contributing to Indian dissent, positively or negatively?
Well, I can't profess to be an expert on the Indian visual media because, frankly, I don't see much of it. But you're right. I mean, the balance between what you might call objectivity and rigorous questioning and empathy is not something that many anchors are able to achieve. So either you're hostile to your subject, or you're overly sycophantic. So you have these two extremes. Um, but you see, approaching an individual or a subject with a measure of empathy, while being unsparing in the questioning, which is what you see in Stone's interview with Putin, is not very common. I mean, I wouldn't say that this is true
Yes.
only of the Indian media, but in general, that sort of approach seems is rare, and perhaps it's a lost art. So one remembers the legendary BBC interviewer Robert Frost. I think Frost, you know, was very good at this kind of
Of course.
that kind of interviewing.
Yes.
But I'm not sure it's a failing only of the Indian media. I think almost anywhere, you have the extremes of hostility and sycophancy, and striking the
Right.
golden mean.
I think we are the only media which is polarized. We can't see another case like this, and we are the world's largest democracy. Sadly,
Yeah, it could be that what you say is true. As I said, I mean, I don't see that much of the media to be able to, make any broad statements about it.
to make a little twist here, agenda setting has been impacting the overall narrative of politics, social development, etc. And media certainly plays a big role. We can't take ourselves away from its impact and its capacity. Few years back, when the corporatization was not reaching to that level, the condition was different. Indian media has shown brave faces as well at times. But do you think in recent years it has done justice to the causes?
Well, as I said, I would leave that to the media experts.
Okay. Okay. So something related to academia, sir. Do you
I mean, no, I mean, one thing I can say is that there's a fair degree of diversity of views, even if there is a diversity in extreme views or whatever. I mean, there is diversity in the Indian media, but whether how far they've
right?
succeeded in sort of doing a competent job is perhaps not something that I'm qualified to pronounce on.
Right. But there is differences as well. There is not, we can say that there is uniformity. Like when we choose print media or digital media, then we see different kind of examples. Even in television, there are different kind of examples. So the
Very
situation is not entirely disappointing. There is hope left. Uh, I will come to the next question. You have rightly portrayed Kanchai Laya as a challenger of the Hindu order. Where do you see Dalit movement is moving from now? Dalit
Yeah.
movements.
Yes. So Kancha Ilaya is not a Dalit. He belongs to the
He-
OBCs.
Right, but
So
he has
it,
been a chronicler of Dalit
yes.
movement.
Yeah. So, but he champions the cause of what he calls Dalit Bahujan. So
Correct.
that's a term which I think was coined by
Kan-
Kanshiram, and
Right,
so it's a category which includes the Dalits and the OBCs, who are of the disadvantaged sections, who have long been the disadvantaged sections of Indian society. And Ilaya is certainly a very able spokesman uh, for that category. Um, so Ilaya makes very interesting points. I think one is that he seems to think that the Dalits are reasonably well taken care of, thanks to the safeguards provided for them in the constitution through the vision of Baba
right.
Sahib Ambedkar and others. The
Reservations.
affirmative action which has been
Yes,
provided for in the constitution, he believes has produced fairly good outcomes for the Dalits, and he does see at least some segment of the Dalits having come up through the constitutional process. But he thinks it is the lower the lower rung of the OBCs who are finding the going a little difficult, because they've neither got had until recently they've neither had the benefit of reservations, nor are they close enough to the upper caste to be lifted up by the upper caste, so to speak.
and the
So he
population
feels,
is also too large.
sorry,
Population is also too large among the
population
OBCs.
is large. So one, yeah, and the other thing he feels is that they have not thrown up a champion comparable to Ambedkar. They are not as well organized as the Dalits. Uh, so so one is the constitutional protection granted to the Dalits. The second is somebody like Ambedkar and various others who have followed after him, who have championed the cause of Dalits very vigorously, and there are not comparable champions perhaps for the lower rung of the OBCs. And so, for these two reasons, he feels that the lower rung of the OBCs have got a raw deal. And a third reason is that the Dalits, many of the Dalits have managed to defect from the Hindu religion to other religions,
Both
such
is
as say,
right.
Buddhism or even
Christianity.
Christianity. But he feels that the OBCs have, by
They're
tradition,
still
been
holding to
too,
their identity.
yes, too strongly bound to the Hindu order to be able
Yes.
to dissociate themselves. So it's an
Mm.
interesting point of view that Ilaya, Kacha Ilaya puts forward. And of course, one of the most notable things about Ilaya, one can disagree with many of the things that he says,
Yes.
and I make my own disagreements fairly clear in that book.
Right.
But he brings the striking thing about Ilaya is the degree of scholarship that he has brought to his cause, and he's been called a modern day Ambedkar,
Yes.
perhaps with some exaggeration. But I think the point is, like Ambedkar, he can fall back on a substantial body of research in order to substantiate his points. The thing about Ambedkar was that he was not a demagogue or a populist. The reason that Dr. Ambedkar was so effective was that his arguments and positions were very well researched. I mean, he's such a great scholar and such a compelling polemicist that it was very difficult for people to refute to combat the weight of arguments, which he was able to present. And so Ilaya does something like that. So basing his positions and his critique of the Hindu order on very solid research.
Kanchailia has been a foremost chronicler of the Dalit community, and he really has that kind of intellectual grasp over the subject matter. But one thing I have consistently missed to see in his argument, that he has never talked about the affluent Dalits who could not establish an egalitarian order for those who left out. Do you think that in that condition making a fairer system is possible?
Pardon?
But do you think that in that case making a fairer system is possible? Personally, I believe that paradigm shift is needed here because Kanchalaya is only looking on one side, where he's blaming Hindu system and its orthodoxy about for the whole mess for the Dalits. But he completely has completely forgotten one thing, that those who came out affluent from Dalit emancipation have not done so much for those people who have been left out.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point that you make. Now that you mention it, yes, perhaps that is not something that I mean. I have not seen him touch upon this particular point. What you're saying is that the creamy layer among the
Yes,
Dalits
creamy layer,
have
who has
not
already
have not done
benefited.
have not done much for those who've been left behind. Now, this may well be true, but perhaps he thinks that that's a secondary issue because he believes that caste continues to operate in one way or the other in very insidious ways in Indian society. And despite the constitutional provisions and despite the political parties' commitment to taking care of the Dalits and others, he does believe that there is some kind of backlash in Indian society against the progress which the Dalits or the Dalit Bahujans have made in recent decades. And so it's going to be a challenge for the good work which has happened in the initial decades after independence to continue where the Dalit Bahujans are concerned. Because I think, and I think there's some merit in what he's saying, there is a backlash which has set in. And he does believe that attempts are underway to negate whatever sort of benefits have been brought to the Dalits or the Dalit Bahujans in recent years. There is an attempt which is being made, which he thinks is, retrograde. I mean, I guess his basic proposition is that caste continues to be a very dominant factor in Indian society, and it operates perhaps today in more sophisticated and insidious ways. And I suppose he thinks there is still a long battle ahead for the Dalit Bahujans.
With the affirmative action and a series of processes ensured through the constitution, it was expected that Dalit community will come forward and destroy the cult culture which has been negatively portrayed in Hindu system. But what happened is exactly opposite today. Dalits have their own chambers. I have nothing against it, the idea, Dalit Chamber of Commerce and Industry. But I'm just trying to put an example whether it is feasible that the caste identity get mixed with the businesses.
Well, I think it's just a way of for them to get organized. You know, so the traditional chambers of commerce and industry, it has been pointed out, don't have much representation from the Dalits, and so I think one of the heartening aspects of you know one of the heartening developments of recent years is that Dalit businessmen have come into their own.
This is really very
and
encouraging.
and, and I think it's natural for them to get organized, just in order to help each other. I wouldn't see that in negative terms at all.
No, even I don't see it because I do help from that side of industry, from industry chamber. So I mean to say that everyone is welcomed in that sphere. My point is they should come and play their role in mainstream. Why to make another set of universe? And of course, all the mainstream chambers have their representations. They're doing fabulous.
Nice.
So, my next question is, by reading the book, one gets an impression that getting David Irving into the list was not easily accepted by your publisher. Could you please focus on this? And also, how did you finally place this historian who could not go ahead to write a biography on Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda in Hitler's cabinet during the World War II? Then Macron was the publisher, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's good that you're bringing up one of the personalities I profiled, David
Yeah.
Irving, who's
Yeah.
a British historian. he's not a professional historian in the sense that he doesn't have a PhD in history. He has a basic degree, I think, BSc or something from Imperial College of Science, and he is a self-taught historian.
Fortunately, even our top historian does not have a PhD. Ramchandra Guha, he certainly has a PhD, but not in history. So it's
Yeah,
a beautiful aspect, actually.
yeah, but
Yes,
Irving doesn't have a PhD in any field, nor has he ever been in academics. So he's not an academic at all. He's a self-taught historian who is renowned for the amount of research that he does. Um, and his field is the history of the Second World War. And the reason that he has acquired notoriety is that he has gone great lengths to present the story of the war, World War II, from the point of view of the Germans, because the narrative that we have been fed, whether through books or even more by Hollywood, is the narrative of the victors. So it is the history told by the victors. But history seen from the other side, that point of view has not got adequate play. And David Irving's particular contribution, as I said, is to highlight, is to tell the story of World War II from the perspective of Hitler and Germany.
yeah.
Now, again, you can see that this is not something that people will take kindly to at all, because everybody is convinced that Hitler is evil, and therefore people would say that there's nothing to be said from the other side. Um, Now, let me make it very clear that Irving does not minimize the atrocities that happened during World War II, the atrocities perpetrated by the Germans, the incredible suffering they caused, and all that. Um, but I think his particular contribution is to focus on the military aspects of the war. You see, there are many multiple strands to the history of World War II. The political side, who was right, who was wrong, etc. And there's the purely military side, which is how the great battles of World War II were conducted. And I think one of the areas where David Irving really makes a contribution is to bring out Hitler's capabilities as a military commander. I mean, Hitler saw himself as a genius, and I think many German generals, many of the top field marshals, also believed that, at least for a considerable length of time. Maybe they got disenchanted towards the end when he started losing. But I think the initial victories of Hitler drew in, a great deal of support, had a great deal of support and backing from the German top brass. And David Irving's contribution is to bring out aspects of Adolf Hitler as a competent military leader. And
Yes.
so, he shows how in several instances Hitler took the right military decisions. And wherever, in many places where he has been faulted for taking the wrong decisions, the people who have criticized him are perhaps in the wrong. And so let me just give one example, which is the Titanic Battle of Stalingrad, which is one of the turning points in World War II, the German assault on Stalingrad. Now, this, in many conventional narratives, Hitler is shown as somebody who sought to pursue his vanity by taking on a city which is named after his arch enemy, Stalin. Whereas David Irving shows that there was a compelling strategic imperative for the German army to go after Stalingrad, because it is a vital port which was sitting on the Volga River, through which supplies from the south, supplies of oil and minerals passed
Right.
to the north, including Moscow and other places. So he believed, but that by getting a dominant position on the Volga River through conquering Stalingrad, he could, strangle the Soviet army very effectively. And so, there was a strategic imperative which is not widely appreciated. Now, it so happened that the tide of battle went against the Germans, and the German army located there, which is the legendary Sixth Army, came to be encircled by the Soviets, and they eventually ended up surrendering. And again, it is said that Hitler was wrong in holding on to Stalingrad, and he should allow the remnants of the army, about 300,000 soldiers, to escape. And David Irving very convincingly demonstrates that perhaps that was simply not feasible, and that the cost of retreat from Stalingrad would have been greater than the cost of holding on. So these particular nuances of World War, of the battles of World War II, is something on is something which David Irving definitely illuminates in a unique sort of way. Now, the reason that he's got demonized is not only because he presents the German point of view, but because he has questioned something which is regarded as unquestionable,
He
which
was
is the
also called
story
a
of the
fascist historian at some point of times. He was also called a fascist historian.
yeah, because he has questioned the story of the Holocaust, which is the
Yes,
extermination of an estimated 6 million Jews. Now, there again, it's very important to be clear about what he says and what he does not say. He does not deny the fact that a large number of Jews perished in German hands, but he has a couple of points of disagreement. He says the number of Jews who were killed may not be 6 million, it's more like 3 to 4 million, which is still a very large number. And there are many historians who are inclined to go along with this particular figure. And the second point that he makes is that it is not true that the vast majority of the Jews perished in gas chambers in the concentration camps. I mean, they did perish in large numbers in the concentration camps, but they died mostly because of starvation and disease, and
yes,
not because they were sent to the gas chambers. Now, so he questions two, you know, vital elements of the Holocaust narrative, which is the number of Jews who perished and the manner in which they perished. And for this, he has been vilified because, to question any aspect of the Holocaust, in many parts of Europe, in some parts of Europe, is to be end up being labeled a Holocaust denier. So you see, he's not denying the Holocaust; he's denying particular
the
aspects of
narrative
it.
kind and narrative.
He's contesting. So this is my point
Right.
about dissent.
Yes,
I'm saying that you may find it revolting that he questions the mainstream narrative, but I don't
yes,
see anything particularly um, sort of repugnant about questioning these points of detail.
right. Yes,
Where he is completely wrong, and I have no hesitation in pointing it out in my book, is in exonerating Hitler from any responsibility for what happens to Jews, which is completely absurd, and for which he is rightly vilified. But I say that by all means condemn David Irving for the things about which he is wrong, but also give him credit for the things for which he is right. You see, so this is the
yes,
point about tolerating dissent.
yeah, yeah, yeah. For me, one of the surprises in this book is the inclusion of economist and former finance minister of Greece, Yanis Varoufakis. Do you think that it is possible to disagree with the establishment and still work with it? Because somewhere you have
Well, I think
pointed it out in that chapter,
yeah.
particular
So
chapter.
yeah. So Yanni Varoufakis was finance minister of Greece for a very short period. I think about 6 months. Um, he's an economist by training, economist and academic, and he was co-opted into the popular party Syriza, which swept to power in Greece. And this party came to power on the promise of repudiating the attempts to um, repudiating the attempt to roll over Greek debt. They came to power on the
Right,
promise to restructure the debt, to insist. Greece had an enormous amount of external debt, which it is impossible for Greece to service. So, whenever a corporate or an individual uh, runs up a level of debt which is impossible to service, and very for reasons beyond their control, so they are not willful defaulters. What happens is that the lender and the borrower sit together and work out an agreement. Okay, you owe us 100 rupees and you cannot service 100 rupees of debt. So let us reduce the number to 70, which you can service with whatever cash flows you are having. So Greece presented the same made the same proposition to their own lenders, and they said it's impossible for us to service this level of debt, and so let us restructure it. And so that is the promise on which the Syriza government came to power, and Varoufakis was supposed to implement that promise, but because all the Western government, all the powers that be, which is the IMF, the European Union, and even the US, they were vigorously opposed to this. This restructuring proposal simply would not be accepted. And the ruling party, instead of siding with the finance minister who was basically trying to implement their election promise, they completely let him down and eventually ensured his ouster from the government.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
so you see, Varoufakis was acceptable as long as he was helping the ruling party to gain votes with the electorate. But the moment he started questioning their stance as a member of the government, he lasted all of 6 months. And so it's
Yeah.
a very, very vivid illustration of what happens to people who are inside the establishment and try to question the basic positions of the establishment.
Right. Having John Pilger featured in this book is delightful for your readers. Even I had enjoyed reading his profile. Do you think his brand of journalism can make the world a better place? I'm emphasizing on journalism again and again. Sorry for that, but you have been a columnist, so there can't be complete escape from this.
Yeah, so John Pilger, the journalist, the distinguished journalist you're referring to, John Pilger was very much part of the mainstream media. He worked for a leading British newspaper for many, many years. Was their international correspondent covering major world events. Um, but
Including China. Including
yeah,
China.
yeah, he was a very distinguished foreign correspondent for a leading British paper. He's in Australia, who worked out of the UK for several decades. But as he developed a sort of a healthy skepticism towards the establishment, he met the same fate that other dissenters have met, which is that he got progressively marginalized to the extent that John Pilger, who has perhaps won more awards than many other journalists, hardly gets any space in the mainstream media in Europe or in the US. So you will find John Pilger being featured in on Russia Today, which is the the independent private Russian television private website. But it's impossible to for John Pilger to make himself heard through the leading British or American papers. And that is
Yes.
again because he mercilessly questioned many of the things which the British establishment does, which the American establishment does. He has questioned the treatment of aborigines in his own country, which is Australia. So, I mean, in the UK, for instance, he was one of those people who called the bluff about the Iraq War. And, those kinds of people, as you know, don't get much of a hearing in the mainstream media. And the very interesting thing when you look at John Pilger is that what has happened in the last, perhaps couple of decades in the mainstream media in the West is some kind of retrogression. I mean, you did have a fair amount of diversity, um, even about 15 to 20 years ago. But today, there is less of that. And so, and I think this is again a point which I made through my book, that people keep saying that there is not enough tolerance of dissent in India, and the political establishment is not tolerant of dissent, and there is not much dissent in the Indian media. But my whole point is that other seemingly freer societies, such as the UK and the US, don't seem to be doing much better. In fact,
Yeah.
sometimes when I think about it closely, I'm inclined to believe that our democracy is far more vibrant than some
Yes.
of the Western democracies whom we are
Right.
told to admire.
Yes. Agree, sir. Agree, sir. Because in recent times, we have seen the digital dissent as well. Edward Snowden, then Julian Assange, and so many. And we have seen how the Western world have dealt with them. So you are very much right in saying that as a democracy, we are much mature. But yes, we also need to improve ourselves. That's another thing. Uh, Sir, you have chosen UG Krishnamurti, who happens to be a spiritual rebel, and you have called him an anti-guru. My curiosity is remains here. How you opted him to this list?
Yeah, I'm happy to go into UG Krishnamurti, but I'm just looking at the clock, and it seems to me that we have run out of
We
our
have time.
time.
We have time. 10 minutes we have.
Yeah, so perhaps we may want to throw the thing open to questioners, but very quickly about UG Krishnamurti, because there isn't much I can explain about him. In a few minutes, people have to read that. So UG Krishnamurti is somebody who's known as an anti-guru, and this is a person who, in conventional terms, would be called an evolved person, in the sense that he reached a state which many of us call, enlightenment or salvation or nirvana or whatever. So he is supposed to have reached that state. But the very interesting thing about him is that he didn't think that it was possible for him to preach something to others which would enable them to get to that state. So his whole, there are two basic points that he makes, which is that the particular state that he reached, where he was free from ego, greed, vanity, and the rest of the human foibles, uh, that state was not any kind of mental or spiritual transformation, but a transformation of the body. So something happened, perhaps triggered by his genes, which caused him to move into that state which we call enlightenment. So that's the first point that he makes, that this is not some kind of spiritual transformation, but a bodily transformation. And the second point that he makes is that this transformation or evolution into a higher state is utterly acausal. It is not the result of following particular practices, observing certain austerities, doing chanting some slokas or whatever. None of these things are going to help you. It happens by the purest accident. And his view is that this is how it happened to the Buddha, this is how it happened to Ramana Maharshi, this is how it happened to J. Krishnamurti, and this is how it happened to him, UG Krishnamurti. And therefore, the fact that somebody like him reached an evolved state has no particular lessons for the rest of us, and it is futile for us to try and aspire for that state or to do anything to reach that state, because anything that we do to reach that state is going to strengthen the ego, which goes counter to that state, which is the annihilation of the ego. The more you try to do something, the more you are going to negate the possibility of reaching it, which is quite the opposite of what the traditional gurus say. They say you do this, that, and the other thing. You practice
Yes.
penance, you practice austerity, you do some incantation, you do some meditation, and you will get there. And he says,
He
sorry, there's no way that you can get there.
was the less demanding guru. He didn't demand anything from his followers. Since the readers are allowing us to get few more minutes because they are listening you rapidly and not putting up questions, I will ask just two questions and I will request you to answer again to me with your quick views on that. First, why you left out so many other rebels who could have been made to your book? There's so many.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a practical limitation.
Because those
But
who get featured in this book should be called themselves lucky. Because with the
well,
depth you have written about them.
yeah, you could say that. I mean, even these profiles of 7 rebels runs into 300 pages, and so there's a practical limitation. I'm sure there are a lot of other dissidents who can be profiled, but as I said, one of the reasons I chose this 7 is because they come from different walks of life. So this book is a celebration not just of dissenters or dissent, but it's a celebration of ideas and a different celebration of ideas in different fields, as I mentioned earlier.
Yes.
And
So
yes,
you have been
but you're absolutely right.
right.
There are many others who would perhaps qualify.
So we can hope that you will come out with another volume.
Well, or perhaps somebody else can do
That
it.
is possible. That is possible. Sir, you have been working in public policy domain and of course in academia. Do you think someone who can be called a rebel in that space, in public policy space? Somebody who could say a spade is a spade? I mean, our life
Well,
is affected with policies lately. So that is also an area.
Well, thanks very much for the compliment, but I think that is for others to judge. Um, yes, I think you're right. My views are often labeled contrarian, but it is not that I set out to be a
I
contrarian.
would rather say I would rather say fair and transparent, non-partisan. I will
Yeah,
not
well,
label you, yeah, being your reader.
well, that is because you want to be kind to me. But others who are not as charitable would say he's being contrarian most of the time. So going counter to the popular view. But it's not that I set out to be contrarian. One of the things about being an academic is that you are in some sense perched in the ivory tower, and so you have the sort of freedom to look at data and facts fairly dispassionately, and go wherever the data and the facts lead you. And so the positions I end up taking, um, I would like to believe, are where the data point me. And so I don't come into the public policy debates preconceived notions. That's what I'd like to
Right.
believe.
Yeah, yes, sir. But to make an observation, your contemporaries like Raghuram Rajan and few others have been raising their voices about policy indecision, policy crisis. Do you believe that India is really facing a policy crisis sort of scenario?
I don't think so at all. Um, on the contrary, I believe that I wrote in a recent article, I think on the
On
last day.
bank reforms
No,
or corporatization of banks?
yeah, so that was one. But there, I'm in agreement with Raghuram Rajan and others. But
Yeah,
I wrote a recent article in Business Standard where I argued that India's handling of the COVID crisis has been quite good,
yes,
and the government got the basic policy responses right. The combination of
yeah,
monetary and fiscal policies which the government came out with seems to have been a fairly effective
yes,
combination. So not only do I not see policy paralysis in the present
right,
dispensation, but I see that the conduct of policies has been fairly effective, and government has not got the due credit for some of the successful policies it has executed.
yes. So wherever the government does some good works, it must get get equal credit for that.
Sure, sure.
Tha-
So
yes,
by all means, shower the government with brickbats, but also spare the occasional bouquet where it is deserved.
yes, yes, of course. And reforms are something I think which will take place because we don't have luxury to dump them. We can't dump them simply. It's very easy to say than do this. Somewhere we need to know the strength of reforms. So it's been wonderful talking to you, and I strongly recommend your book to the readers, to your potential readers. The book is published by Penguin Random House India. It is available across the bookstores and also on e-platforms. So thank you very much for joining today's discussion at KLF's.
Thank you, Atul. Always a pleasure to interact with you. Thank you very
Same
much.
here, sir. Thank you.
And
All the best, sir.
I do want to thank the sponsors, the host, Kalinga Literary
Yes,
Festival. Also. Thank you
yes.
very much.
Thank you, sir.